It began with something far more unsettling than sound. It began with absence. At first, it was not something the mind fully registered. There was no immediate shock, no sudden realization, no emotional reaction that usually accompanies loss or disruption. Instead, there was only a quiet visual inconsistency in a place that was expected to remain unchanged. The driveway was empty. And in that emptiness, nothing appeared obviously wrong. Because mornings are built on routine. The human mind is trained to expect repetition so strongly that it stops actively verifying it. It relies on memory and pattern instead of direct observation. It assumes continuity rather than questioning it. So, when the driveway was seen without the car, the first reaction was not alarm. It was uncertainty. A small internal correction attempted to adjust the perception. A quiet assumption formed automatically, suggesting that the car might simply be parked elsewhere. That perhaps the angle of view was misleading. That maybe memory had not fully aligned with reality yet. These are natural cognitive defenses. The mind protects itself from disruption by attempting to normalize what does not immediately make sense. But that attempt only lasts for a few seconds. Because the longer the eyes remain fixed on the empty space, the more unstable that explanation becomes. The driveway is not just empty in a casual sense. It is completely undisturbed. There are no tire marks indicating a recent departure. No subtle shifts in gravel or concrete that would suggest movement. No small imperfections in alignment that usually accompany the repositioning of a vehicle. Even the ambient order of the environment remains intact, as though nothing had interacted with it recently at all. And that is when the feeling begins to change. Because absence is one thing. But perfect absence is something else entirely. The mind begins to compare what is seen with what is remembered. It reconstructs the expected image of the car sitting in its usual position, aligned with the space it had occupied countless times before. That mental image is stable, clear, and precise. And when that internal image is placed over the external reality, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Something is missing. Not misplaced. Not temporarily relocated. Missing in the most complete sense of the word. And once that realization forms, it cannot be undone. The absence of the car transforms from a visual observation into an event. Because objects do not simply disappear from controlled environments. They are moved, removed, relocated. Each of those possibilities implies action. And action implies intent. At that point, the driveway is no longer just a physical space. It becomes evidence of interference. A space that has been altered without visible explanation. And that lack of explanation creates a deeper tension than the absence itself. Because in structured environments, especially residential communities governed by strict rules, there are always systems in place that regulate movement, parking, and enforcement. Nothing is supposed to be taken without notice. Nothing is supposed to be removed without documentation or reason. And yet, here there is neither. No warning. No indication. No trace of process. Only silence. And silence in situations like this does not feel neutral. It feels intentional. The absence begins to carry meaning beyond itself. It becomes less about the car and more about the possibility that something has been done quietly, without immediate acknowledgement. That somewhere within the structure of authority that governs the neighborhood, a decision may have been made without direct communication. And that thought begins to narrow the possibilities. Because in communities governed by HOAs, there is always a framework of enforcement that exists parallel to ownership. Parking regulations. Compliance rules. Towing policies. These systems are designed to maintain order, but they also grant authority to act under specific conditions. And once that system enters the equation, the situation takes on a different shape. Because it introduces the possibility that the removal was not random. It was authorized. Or at least believed to be authorized by someone within that structure. And that distinction becomes critical. Because authority without transparency can often blur the line between enforcement and overreach. At this stage, however, there is still no confirmation. Only observation. Only the gradual recognition that the situation does not fit within normal expectations. And that is where the discomfort begins to settle more deeply. Not as panic. But as focus. A quiet mental shift from assumption to analysis. Because when something familiar is altered without explanation, the natural response is no longer emotional, it becomes investigative. The driveway remains unchanged, but perception of it does not. It is no longer just a space where a car should be. It is a space where something used to exist and no longer does, without any visible reason for that change. And that absence demands explanation. The first attempt to resolve the uncertainty is instinctive. The mind tries to reconstruct normality before accepting disruption. It considers simple explanations first, because simplicity is psychologically safer than complexity. It suggests that the car might have been parked elsewhere, that it may have been moved temporarily, that memory might not yet have aligned with reality. These thoughts form quickly, almost automatically, as a protective mechanism against confusion. But each possibility weakens as soon as it is examined. Because memory of the last placement is not vague. It is precise. The car was parked here. In this exact space. At a specific time that is clearly remembered without ambiguity. And when memory is precise, doubt becomes difficult to sustain. The uncertainty collapses. And what remains is a more direct conclusion. The car is not misplaced. It is not forgotten. It is gone. And that single recognition changes everything that follows. Because gone implies action. It implies removal. And removal cannot occur without a source. A decision maker. A mechanism through which that decision is carried out. And in a residential environment governed by strict community rules, that immediately raises structural questions. Who had the authority to remove it? Under what condition? With what justification? And why was no notice provided? These questions begin to form naturally, not as emotional reactions, but as logical consequences of observation. And as they form, a framework begins to emerge. Because within this neighborhood, there is one system that holds influence over parking enforcement. The HOA. The idea does not arrive as accusation. It arrives as structure. A narrowing of possibilities based on how authority is distributed within the environment. Because in such communities, enforcement of rules is often delegated. Towing companies operate under agreements. Parking violations are monitored through policy interpretation. Actions are taken based on rules that are not always visible at the moment they are enforced. And that introduces a new layer of complexity. Because it means the removal may not have been a rogue action. It may have been an execution of policy. Or something presented as policy. And that possibility deepens the uncertainty rather than resolving it. Because if the system acted, then the system believes it was justified. But justification and correctness are not always the same thing. The realization begins to reshape the entire situation. What started as a missing vehicle becomes something more structured. A potential enforcement action. A possible overreach. Or a decision made without proper communication. And each possibility carries implications that extend beyond a single incident. Because this is no longer just about a car. It is about authority. About process. About whether rules are being followed, or interpreted beyond their intended boundaries. And that is where the tension fully forms. Not in the absence itself. But in what that absence might represent. And in the growing awareness that the explanation, whatever it is, may reveal far more than just where the car went. The realization did not bring immediate answers. Instead, it brought structure to confusion. Because once the car was understood as not simply missing, but removed, the situation stopped being random and started becoming procedural. And procedural actions always come from systems. Systems built on rules. Rules interpreted by people. People acting under authority. And in this neighborhood, that authority was not difficult to identify. The homeowners association had always existed as a background presence, quiet, consistent, and seemingly predictable. It was the kind of structure that did not demand attention every day, but influenced nearly everything beneath the surface. Parking rules, property standards, maintenance expectations, each layer of daily life had some level of HOA involvement. At first, it had never felt threatening. It felt administrative. Neutral. A system designed to maintain order rather than impose control. But systems do not remain static forever. Over time, subtle changes begin to appear. Not in dramatic announcements or sudden shifts, but in small adjustments that gradually alter how rules are interpreted and enforced. Parking regulations become more specific. Notices become more frequent. Enforcement becomes less forgiving. And without realizing it, the tone of the system changes. What was once guidance begins to feel like instruction. And instruction, when repeated often enough, begins to feel like authority. The parking rules in particular had always been strict, but manageable. They were meant to ensure that shared spaces remained accessible and organized. There were designated areas, clear restrictions, and enforcement protocols that seemed reasonable when explained. But the key word was explained. Because over time, explanations became less frequent. Rules were still enforced, but justification was not always visible. Decisions were made, but reasoning was not always communicated in detail. Notices appeared after actions had already been taken, rather than before. And that shift mattered more than it initially appeared. Because enforcement without explanation changes the balance of understanding. It removes context. And without context, every action feels more absolute than it may actually be. That is how tension begins to form inside systems that rely on compliance. Not through force, but through uncertainty. And uncertainty was exactly what this situation was now built on. The missing car was no longer just a single event. It was becoming a reflection of how enforcement operated in practice. Because for a vehicle to be removed, certain conditions must be met. There must be a violation, or at least an interpretation of one. There must be a decision, made by someone or something with authority. And there must be execution of that decision, typically carried out through a third party. Towing companies do not act independently in residential communities like this. They act under instruction. Which means somewhere in the chain of events, a decision had been made. And that decision had consequences. The most important question, however, was not what happened after the car was removed. It was what justified its removal in the first place. Because justification is the foundation of enforcement legitimacy. Without it, action becomes arbitrary. And arbitrary action in a regulated environment is not supposed to exist. At least, not openly. As the situation was examined more closely, attention began to shift toward patterns rather than the single event itself. Because isolated incidents can sometimes be explained away. Mistakes can happen. Miscommunication is possible. Errors in enforcement can occur. But patterns are different. Patterns suggest repetition. And repetition suggests intent. Other residents had experienced similar situations, though not always identical. Some mentioned warnings that seemed unclear. Others referred to parking disputes that escalated quickly. A few described vehicles being targeted after short periods of absence or minor misunderstandings. Individually, none of these situations were enough to form a conclusion. But together, they began to outline something less visible but more significant. A system of enforcement that did not always operate with consistent transparency. And that realization shifted the emotional weight of the situation. Because now it was no longer just about one car. It was about how decisions were being made. And whether those decisions followed the rules as they were written, or as they were interpreted in practice. The difference between those two is not small. It determines whether a system is fair or selective. Structured or flexible in ways that may not always be visible to those affected by it. The absence of the car became a symbol of that uncertainty. Because it represented something that could be removed without immediate explanation, without visible process, and without clear communication. And once that possibility enters awareness, it changes how everything else is viewed. Even ordinary details begin to feel different. Parking signs that were once ignored now feel more deliberate. Notices posted in shared spaces begin to carry more weight. Conversations about rules and enforcement take on new meaning. Because the question is no longer theoretical. It is personal. Something had been taken. And the reason was not yet clear. That lack of clarity created a new kind of focus. Not emotional reaction. But investigative attention. Because when systems behave in ways that do not immediately make sense, understanding becomes necessary. Not optional. The missing car was now more than an inconvenience. It was a signal. That something within the structure of enforcement may not be operating in the way it appears. And if that was true, then the next step was not to accept the situation as final. It was to understand it. Completely. Because only by understanding how the decision was made could the truth behind it begin to emerge. And that search for understanding had only just begun. The situation no longer felt like a simple misunderstanding. What began as confusion over a missing car slowly evolved into something heavier, something that sat in the mind and refused to leave. There was a growing awareness that what had happened was not random, not accidental, and not harmless. It was intentional. And that realization carried emotional weight. Because when something is taken without warning, the first reaction is disbelief. The second is frustration. But the third, once time passes, is focus. A shift from emotional reaction to mental analysis. A need to understand the structure behind the action. The absence of the car created a disruption that extended beyond inconvenience. It affected routine, expectation, and the sense of stability that comes from knowing your property is secure within its own boundaries. That sense had been interrupted. And interruptions like that are not easily ignored. The more the situation was reflected on, the more it became clear that this was not an isolated mistake. There were too many elements that didn't align with normal procedure. Too many gaps in explanation. Too many missing details that should have been present if everything had been done correctly. That absence of clarity became more important than the missing car itself. Because clarity is what separates justified action from questionable action. Without it, everything becomes uncertain. The focus began to shift toward documentation, past experiences, and any detail that might explain how such a decision could have been made. And in doing so, subtle patterns started to emerge. Other residents had occasionally mentioned unusual enforcement behavior. Parking disputes that escalated too quickly. Situations where rules seemed applied inconsistently. At the time, those stories had not seemed connected. But now they did. And once connections begin forming, they are difficult to unsee. What once felt like isolated frustration started to resemble a larger pattern of enforcement behavior that lacked consistency and transparency. That realization created emotional tension. Not anger in its raw form, but something more structured. A steady pressure that builds internally as unanswered questions accumulate. Because the issue was no longer just about what happened. It was about why it happened. And that question remained unanswered. As more attention was given to the situation, it stopped being personal. It began to spread. Other residents started sharing similar experiences, not as coordinated complaints, but as separate observations that unexpectedly aligned. Vehicles being towed under unclear circumstances. Notices appearing after actions had already been taken. Rules being enforced in ways that felt inconsistent depending on the situation. Individually, each case could be dismissed. But together, they formed something harder to ignore. A pattern. And patterns change everything. Because they suggest structure beneath randomness. The HOA, which had once operated quietly in the background of the neighborhood, now became the subject of closer observation. Not confrontation, but attention. People began reviewing past notices, comparing experiences, and questioning whether enforcement had always been as consistent as it appeared. This shift in awareness created tension within the system itself. Because systems that rely on compliance function best when they are not questioned. When rules are accepted without detailed examination. When enforcement is seen as neutral and predictable. But once people begin to look closer, the structure becomes exposed. And exposure creates pressure. The towing incident that started everything was no longer viewed in isolation. It was now part of a larger conversation about how decisions were being made, and whether those decisions were always aligned with the written rules. The absence of transparency became the central concern. Not the action itself, but the lack of explanation behind it. And that absence began to weaken trust. Because trust is not broken by a single event. It is broken by repeated uncertainty. As discussions continued, one question began to surface more frequently than others. How were these decisions being approved? Because somewhere within the structure, approval had to exist. Someone had to authorize enforcement. Someone had to determine whether a violation justified towing. And if that process was unclear, then the entire system became uncertain. That uncertainty marked a turning point. What had once been a private issue now became a shared concern. And shared concerns do not remain contained for long. The deeper the situation was examined, the less random it appeared. Records and past notices began to reveal inconsistencies that were not immediately obvious at first glance. Some towing actions lacked clear supporting documentation. Certain violations appeared escalated faster than others without clear explanation. And in some cases, similar parking situations were treated differently depending on timing or context. At first, these inconsistencies seemed like administrative errors. But as more examples were compared, a pattern began to form. And that pattern pointed toward something more structured. Not chaos. But selective application. The rules themselves had not necessarily changed. But the way they were being applied had. And that difference was significant. Because when enforcement becomes selective, it stops being purely procedural and begins to reflect interpretation. And interpretation introduces subjectivity. And subjectivity introduces inconsistency. The towing incident that started everything was no longer just about a single decision. It was now part of a broader pattern of enforcement behavior that did not always align perfectly with written guidelines. And that realization shifted everything. Because it meant the issue was not just about whether the car had been towed correctly or incorrectly. It was about how decisions were being made in general. And whether those decisions were always based on transparent criteria. That question carried weight. Because if enforcement could vary without clear explanation, then every action within that system had to be reconsidered. The certainty that once existed began to fade. and in its place came analysis. Careful, structured, deliberate examination of how authority was being applied. And what emerged was not a single mistake, but a pattern of behavior that required attention. Once the pattern became clear, the situation reached a point where it could no longer remain unaddressed. The inconsistencies were too numerous to dismiss as coincidence. The lack of transparency too consistent to ignore. What had started as a single incident had revealed something larger about how the system operated. And once revealed, it could not be unseen. The structure of enforcement came under review. Decisions were re-examined. Procedures were questioned. And gradually, adjustments were made to bring actions back in line with documented rules rather than informal interpretation. The process was not immediate. But it was necessary. Because systems only function properly when their actions can be explained and justified clearly. Without that, trust begins to erode, and once trust erodes, even correct actions can be questioned. The resolution restored more than just order. It restored clarity. The missing car became more than an isolated event. It became the trigger that exposed how easily assumptions can replace transparency when systems go unchecked. And the final understanding was simple but important. Rules only work when they are applied consistently. Authority only works when it is accountable. And without both, even structured systems can drift into uncertainty without anyone noticing at first. In the end, the situation was not just about a car being towed. It was about awareness. And what happens when someone finally decides to look closer at something that was never meant to be questioned?